very humble guy. We had a briefing with him over the weekend, and I think he was like driving a Gremlin, and he was by himself. So he's definitely not wasting your money. I want you to know that. But he's going to come up and talk about some new strategic thinking for cloud computing in the federal government. So Vivek.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. It's great to be in San Francisco. What I want to talk about is where the US government is headed when it comes to cloud computing. And I'm especially excited this morning because we're unveiling our cloud computing strategy for the US government. It's available on CIO.gov. It's a culmination of 2 years of work in shifting the mindset of the United States government from asset ownership to service provisioning. What I want to share with you on the first slide is actually what we're doing as far as the need for change across the federal government. If we can flip to the next slide, please. What you'll see on this slide is what's going on with other industrialized countries when it comes to manufacturing. Whether it's Brazil, France, the European Union, or a number of other nation states. On average, as far as manufacturing is concerned, the productivity or manufacturing capacity utilization is actually at about 79%. Yet, when you look at the typical server in the United States government, the utilization is at 27%, and that's a best case. And in many agencies, we're looking at utilization of those servers at about 10 to 15%. Now, the question is, if at a nation-state level, we're driving productivity utilization or manufacturing utilization at about 79%, why do we settle for a subpar utilization when it comes to our computers, when it comes to our servers? And that's 50% below what's happening in manufacturing. That's a huge challenge. Now, if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is why it's so important for the US government to move forward to the cloud. In the last decade alone, we went from 432 data centers to 2,094 data centers. Yet, in the private sector, most companies like IBM have gone the other way. IBM went from 235 data centers down to 12 in about the same period. What we're burdened with, unfortunately, when it comes to efficiency is on top of the low asset utilization is this duplicative spending in these tough economic times. We have a difficult to manage infrastructure that's fragmented across the federal government and poses a security threat. When it comes to agility, it can take years to actually build out these data centers and months to provision services as we set up server after server building out this infrastructure. And in terms of innovation, unfortunately, we're decoupled from the private engines of innovation because the government continues to build on-premise software, custom software, where we literally are throwing bodies at problems at $300 to $600 an hour rather than tapping into the innovative spirit of some of the companies that are present here today. And also, what this does is it feeds into this culture that's very, very risk-averse. So typical CIOs, at the federal government end up spending more time managing this arcane infrastructure than they actually do in serving the American people. Whether that's making sure that your experience when you file for student aid is as simple as booking a hotel reservation on OpenTable, or whether your interactions when it comes to dealing with the IRS are as streamlined as making a reservation online for an airline, or whether you're looking at Medicare and Medicaid services. Across the board, what's happened is because we spend so much time on investing in this duplicative infrastructure, we haven't spent sufficient time in making sure that we're serving the American people properly. In the next slide, what you'll see is a fundamental shift in capital allocation that we're looking to drive as part of the President's budget in 2012 and in the coming years. If you look at the $80 billion that we spend every year on information technology, 20 billion of that we've been able to identify can actually move to the cloud. And what's exciting about this opportunity is it moves us to this culture where we can actually provision services rather than continue to build duplicative investments. It moves us to an environment where we can begin to aggregate a lot of the demands of the federal government as we begin this shift. We've already committed, as part of the President's budget, to shut down 800 data centers by 2015. And we're already on a path to actually move more infrastructure, more services over to the cloud so we can actually tap into innovation that's happening in Silicon Valley and other parts of the country. If we go to the next slide, please. Here's a breakdown of the departments and where we see potential spending moving to the cloud. So from Department of Homeland Security to Treasury to Commerce, across the board, agencies have identified investments that are going to begin moving to the cloud in the next couple of years. As part of the administration's drive to crack down on wasteful spending, what we're doing is we're making sure that each agency has identified at least 3 systems that they're going to be moving to the cloud in the next 18 months or so. And these are not just simple systems, but these are going to be systems that are core to the workflow of these agencies. And these are systems that are going to be disruptive in terms of budget savings. Next slide, please. So this is not just theory or a strategy that's just an idea, but we've proven through execution. And I wanted to share with you some examples where we've seen tremendous savings, but more important than savings is actually where we've improved service, whether it's within the government or service to the American people. At the Health and Human Services, we were able to leverage the Salesforce platform. And by leveraging that platform, what we were able to do is actually issue electronic health record grants to over 100,000 physicians. And we were able to reduce the time to go live from 1 year to about 3 months. At GSA, we're in the process of moving 17,000 users to the Google Apps platform. And they're on an old, fragmented infrastructure where they had 17 different email systems that couldn't really talk to each other easily. And now they're moving to a single platform. At the Army, we were again able to move to another Salesforce platform here. And essentially, we were able to look at a contract where we had gotten a bid that was over $1 million and cut that cost down to actually $54,000. And on top of that, drive up the productivity of the Army. At the Recovery Board, a simple website that was being hosted, this is recovery.gov, was moved to the Amazon EC2 cloud, saving $750,000, but more importantly, the money that we saved was actually put back into the mission of the board to fight fraud. At the Department of Agriculture, we're able to move to the Azure platform. And we're actually in the process of migrating 120,000 users to that platform. And it's going to save us $27 million. And it's going to consolidate these 21 systems that, again, are duplicative and couldn't really talk to each other. So as I talk about aggregating demand, as I talk about this shift to the cloud, and this tremendous opportunity in terms of the $20 billion, we've got to do a number of things to make sure that we're catalyzing the adoption of cloud computing. Next slide, please. So we want to talk about 4 areas that we're spending a lot of energy on. The first area is around security. The second area is around standards. Third, around procurement. And fourth, around governance. In security, we're very, very focused on making sure that we lower the coefficient of friction as we move to the cloud. And what I mean by that is right now, as vendors sell to the US government, one of the biggest challenges is that you've got to get certified by every single agency that you're selling to. It's inefficient, it costs a lot of money, and frankly, it doesn't necessarily produce better security. That is one of the reasons we're moving towards a centralized certification and accreditation process that's going to allow vendors to get certified once and have the ability to sell across the government. Second area is that historically we've treated all threats as equal. We haven't had the ability to actually prioritize. To give you an example, the State Department, over a course of 6 years, had spent about $138 million on paperwork certifications. And these documents filed away were probably more secure than the systems they were supposed to protect. And part of what we're trying to move to is an environment of real-time continuous monitoring to identify the top threats. And DHS is going to be very focused on making sure that we're identifying the top threats that face the US government and the vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. But we also want to make sure that as we begin to move to the cloud, that we trust the vendor relationships, but we want to be able to verify that the sensitive data that's moving to the cloud, that it is being protected. And we're shifting to an environment where we want to be able to get security dashboards with companies with which we engage in contracts in terms of moving a lot of that funding and moving a lot of those systems to the cloud itself. In the standards world, we're working very hard with NIST. We've actually set up a number of bodies to look at the standards that we're putting in place. It's very important, especially when it comes to interoperability, portability, and security. And part of what we're doing is we're bringing in the private sector and the academic communities to work with us to drive a consensus-driven standards framework for the cloud. As more and more of these resources move to the cloud, it's going to be very important from a government perspective to make sure that we're not in a vendor lock-in, so that vital services can be pulled out of one cloud provider and provisioned with another cloud provider. That work is very, very important, and the way we're doing it is not through a 7 to 10-year process where we're going to sit down and work on standards, but it's actually using technical case studies and reference architectures as we look at some of the solutions that I talked about that are moving to the cloud already. On the procurement front, we're actually putting in place a number of government-wide enterprise procurement, and I've been working very closely with the state and local governments to make sure that as we look at the economic climate and the tough budget decisions that we need to make, that the states and local governments can also leverage the centralized procurements that we're putting in place. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be putting out a major procurement around collaboration and the cloud. We've already put out a set of procurements on infrastructure as a service that was awarded last year to 12 different vendors. And our roadmap, as we look out 18 months or so, we also want to disrupt financial systems within the US government, which unfortunately have been a source of a lot of wasteful spending. In the summer of last year, we actually halted about $20 billion worth of financial systems to make sure that we're terminating or turning those investments around. And that's an area that we want to see more innovation in, so we could start provisioning a lot of those systems as cloud providers evolve those solutions. So you're going to see more procurements in terms of services that we want to move to the cloud, but we're also going to be eliminating a lot of the barriers that get in the way of startup companies, small companies that can actually sell into the federal government. And from a governance perspective, we've set in place policy, which is our cloud-first policy, that every agency must first evaluate a viable cloud solution before they go out there and make, whether it's redundant investments or procure redundant infrastructure. But what we're also doing is we're setting that as part of the budget process. Because at the end of the day, the way you drive policy is through budget. And in the fiscal year 2012 and beyond, cloud is at the heart of how we are going to be moving and provisioning IT in the coming years. We're also very interested in, from a governance perspective, in thinking about the international dimensions of cloud computing. There are a whole host of questions that arise, such as data sovereignty. What happens, when data moves to other parts of the world? Which laws apply? What are the frameworks? What are the standards? So I'm working very closely, with the Department of Commerce, the State Department, our partners within the European Union, the World Economic Forum, to think about some of those issues as we think about global frameworks when it comes to the information technology grid, specifically when it comes to cloud computing. Next slide, please.